Hi, welcome to this week's Authors Love Readers podcast, where we delve into the stories behind the stories. We're asking authors questions, some of them fun, some of them serious, and from their answers, you're going to learn things you never knew about the people who write the stories you love. My name is Patricia McLinn. I'm your host and designated question asker.
I'm Mark Leslie, and I'm an author who loves readers.
Now, let's start the show. Hi, and welcome to this week's edition of Authors Love Readers podcast. I am so excited to have Mark Leslie here this week, partly because he writes in a genre that I know so little about. And so I'm really interested in finding out more about this. And the reason I don't know very much about it is it scares the bejeebers out of me. So but I know Mark himself is not a scary person. He is a lovely person. And I know him mostly, and at least initially, from his representation of Kobo at Novelists Inc. and some other conferences. But listeners of the podcast know Novelists Inc. tends to be a theme here. So I know Mark from there, and I would love Mark to say hello and tell us a little bit about his writing.
Hey, Pat, thanks so much for having me on the show. I write under the name Mark Leslie, and that is actually, Leslie's my middle name because most people cannot pronounce the name Lefebvre, which is the last name you probably, that's my nickname.
Yes.
Or was the name that I used when I take off
you
my
were Mark
fiction
L.
hat. I'm Mark L. Mark L is so much easier. But I went with Leslie because I was always proud of my middle name, and I'd always written out my full name on school assignments, etc. when I was a kid. So when it came to writing, at the time I was a huge fan of Piers Anthony. And Piers Anthony, what I loved most about his writing is the notes he put at the end of his novels. He wrote, pages and pages of behind the scenes stuff. And in it is one of the ones he explained his real last name. Like his name was Piers Anthony Jacob Dillingham something something something. And went on forever. And so I went, hey, he used his middle name as his last name. I have a cool middle name. Why don't I do that? And so from the age of 15, when I sent my first story off, I started doing that.
Now, is Leslie a family name?
Yeah, it is actually the first name of my uncle and godfather, who I was named after at birth. So it was always a cool thing. And then, of course, when we had a son, we gave him the middle name Leslie, so that we both had the same matching names in case, like the Martin Sheen, because that's not really his last name. His real last name is Estevez, and then Charlie Sheen, So I thought, just in case that happens.
Just in case.
We both want to have pseudonyms together.
So I think of that as a Scottish last name?
It actually, Leslie does have Scottish origins as well, which is really cool because I think I would look awesome in a kilt.
I think you would too. You're pretty tall though. You'd have to have a lot of material.
Yeah, or it would be too. Then I would be scary, Mark.
Yeah, well, I don't think we want a short kilt.
No, we don't want to go there.
So, okay, we mentioned your job, your previous job, Kobo, but you're now writing full time.
That's right.
Yay!
Yeah,
that is such a wonderful moment for an author.
It really is.
Did you do anything to celebrate it?
I stopped driving into Toronto every day for 3 hours out of my day, back and forth. So yeah, that was the big celebration. It kind of coincided with a whole bunch of things. So around the time I was leaving the full-time employment with Kobo, which I loved, I adored working there. It was great. Loved working with the people. I also moved from Hamilton to Waterloo. I moved in with my partner Liz. And it's great. So one of the things we did was we did a lot of work on the house. We created a giant den or office or workspace or library. I'm surrounded as I have to be by books. And of course, we have the token vanity bookshelf where I've got, overstock of my books. Because you have to have those. I mean, because I do a lot of Comic-Cons because of the subject area that I work in, and that requires, purchasing a bunch of the books and then selling them at author tables because those tend to work really, really well. And they're a great way to interact with people. I love when people come up and say, "Oh my God, I can't believe you have a table here. I've read X." And that to me as an author is one of the most exciting moments. I mean, the exciting moment of creating the story is always phenomenal, but when you get to meet someone who's read your stuff and you get to connect with them, that's why I've been a bookseller for 25 years. I just adored that people connecting over books thing. And now I get to do the writer aspect of it than I've had the opportunity to do in the last 25 years.
You have just given me about 34 follow-up questions.
Okay.
Let's start with, I want to start with one a reader asks a lot.
Okay.
Asks about your where you work and if you have an inspiring view. So since you just redid this space for yourself, what did you choose?
So we have a really dark, like a burgundy red walls. I've got a beautiful print from James Lumbers, which is a print of Hemingway with his cats. And James Lumbers has this series called Moments in Time. And in the Moments in Time series, it's a scene or a setting, and he has a ghostly image. So it's the ghostly image of Hemingway sitting at the typewriter. The cats are aware he's there, but obviously he's a ghost, so no one can see him. And the painting is called The Sun Never Set. And so that is right above the book chair, which is this beautiful armchair that we got from Leon's, I think, years ago, which is a furniture warehouse. And I saw it. I had to have it. It's my absolute favorite chair in the world. And of course, books. I mean, I'm just surrounded by books. And I am at most times surrounded by 4 animals, 2 dogs and 2 cats that kind of hang out all day with me in this room.
That's terrific. Now, when you're sitting at the computer, are you looking at that print or is that in another?
I can see it right now, right across on the far side of the room, right above the book chair. Now, if I look to my left, I can actually see outside. There's the window, which is great. And the cats love perching up on the right beside the printer, which is right by the window and the filing cabinet. And so, yeah, it's been fun. Okay, so 2 of the cats are about to get into a cat fight, so we might hear that in the background in a second. Just some ambiance with the fighting cats.
It's part of the author's life, right?
It apparently is.
Now, one of the things as you describe that print, it makes me think of the author's legacy.
Right.
You know, do you find that inspiring or daunting?
A little bit of both, because I mean, it's inspiring. I mean, when I was young and first discovered you could put a pencil or pen to paper, create something, walk away, and someone else could enjoy it at any other time on their own timeline. That to me was magic. When I learned that I could take these stories that were floating around in my head, and I could put them on paper. And it was stick figure cartoons when I started, and then it became, an actual manual Underwood typewriter because I'm of that age. And then it became computers later on. So that inspires me. But then it also, I mean, in some aspects, it can be a little bit daunting because sometimes, or oftentimes, we pour our hearts out onto the page. And whatever we poured out that day, or however it got edited and modified, is there. So books I've published in 2004 are still there, and the words I wrote are still there, and that can be. I guess it could be daunting to think of it that way, but I tend not to think of it as this is the impression for me. I think of it as this is something that I have provided, and hopefully. Because I write the kind of material that I want to read, hopefully there are other people out there like me who read and enjoy that, and they get something from it. So that, I think the inspiration outweighs the daunting.
Well, now you've given me 2 more follow-up questions.
Okay.
We're never going to get to the regular questions. Okay, first of all, you have not said what you write.
Oh my God. Well, I write stories. I write fiction. I write what you would think of it as, most people would think of it as Twilight Zone or Black Mirror style fiction, which I usually use the word horror because when I would write a story, it wouldn't necessarily fall in the fantasy genre because it didn't have the Tolkien dragons and epic fantasy and sword and sorcery. And it didn't have, science fiction elements because it wasn't the hard science fiction. I just thought, well, horror kind of fit because it was sort of, contemporary, but something weird or supernatural may have happened, or eerie or unexplainable. So I called it horror, realizing it's not necessarily horror. I can't call it Twilight Zone fiction. But I
Because it's
think,
trademark.
yeah, but I think people who like those kinds of amazing stories, weird tales, because it tends to cross genre boundaries. So I write those fiction tales,
Yeah.
and then I also write nonfiction ghost stories, true or tales told as true ghost stories about different places.
That's really interesting because you've described your writing to me previously as horror,
Yeah.
which I stay away from. It's one genre. I don't like being scared.
Yes.
Thank you very much. But the Twilight Zone, when you said that, that's much more appealing to me.
Yeah.
And so there may be more readers like me out there.
Yeah, it's funny. I just had one of my books, or one of my little booklets. I call it a digital chapbook because it was 3 short stories. I had it converted into audio, and the narrator normally read romance, and so a whole bunch of people came to listen to my horror stories about
Oh,
books, and they came to it and they went, "Whoa, I've never read stuff like this," and they actually enjoyed it. It was a little bit darker than they were used to, but
yeah, yeah.
because of this amazing narrator, they went, "Wow, this is an author I should check out." Like, and they wouldn't have checked me out probably because it was marketed. It's got a skull on a book on the cover, so it's going to be dark. But I find that, yeah, it's kind of interesting because horror doesn't properly do it justice. But I would rather people don't read my stuff if they're not comfortable with reading about the macabre and the dark, because most of my stories either involve some sort of scary supernatural. So fear is a strong element in my writing as well, because I will be the first to admit that I am the biggest chicken in the world. I believe in the monster under my bed. You cannot tell me he's not real. And when my son was little and he said, "Dad, the boogeyman is here," like he'd come into the room in the middle of the night, I would go, "Oh my God, the boogeyman. I've always been afraid of this. Run." So I mean, so a lot of my stuff has to, actually, I do have stories about the night. One story was the night that when Charlie was 8 years old, he watched the Sandman kill the Tooth Fairy, and it's a
Oh
story about a
dear.
man who can see things that we only think are fictitious, like Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny, but he can also see the Sandman and the Tooth Fairy and all these other things. So he lives his entire life seeing these characters. So, for example, when his wife realizes she doesn't love him, he's at this picnic or barbecue, and he actually sees Cupid shooting his wife and another man through the heart with the arrows, and then that night she tells him she doesn't love him. So I was like, imagine if you could see all the things that people imagine exist, or do they? Maybe we just don't see them. So that was kind of a fun. But again, it's dark. The Sandman kills the Tooth Fairy in the opening scene.
That is pretty
Yeah.
dark. Well, and as you were talking about the boogeyman in the bedroom and stuff, I'm thinking, I wonder if my not wanting to be scared stems from, I believe that there was somebody who lived under the bed, and they could, as a kid,
Yeah.
long time ago, I believe this, and that they
Well, you
could
don't believe it
grab
now?
my ankles and suck me under the
Okay, say
bed.
they're still
Well,
there. That's why I don't have an under the bed now that I'm an adult and have a choice. Are you kidding me? My bed goes right down to the
no,
floor, man. That's it. There's nothing under the bed, so I'm safe, at least for now.
no. So then I have 2 older siblings, significantly older siblings, and my sister convinced me that there was nothing under the bed. I no longer had to jump from the doorway into the middle of the bed to get to bed safely.
That is the best way to get
So
into a bed, even if there is no monster.
it does make the middle of the bed sink, but over time.
Did you
So
saw
I'm being brave. I'm doing it. I'm going to bed. I am walking to the bed.
Wow.
My brother grabs my ankles from
Oh
under the bed.
no. Oh my God. I love him and hate him at the same time.
So I am forever scarred.
Oh my goodness. And then you probably
I
watched
did kick him
Poltergeist when
good.
you were a kid, right?
I know.
Oh,
I did not
don't
watch
ever
it.
watch
I
the
know some of the
original.
lines.
The
No.
clown under the bed, the kid, just a nasty
Uh,
scene.
no.
That was
No,
not a
no,
good thing for
no.
me to see when I think it was 10 or 11 when I saw it. Not a good thing for me to see.
So does this exorcise your fear?
Yeah, I think it's funny. I sometimes think of it as therapy. I think, well, you know how if you expose yourself to some stuff, maybe it helps you not be frightened of it. And you know what? I've been writing this stuff, God, since I was 15 years old, a little bit younger. And no, not yet. So I'm still looking for the cure. I'm still working really. Researchers are hard at work every day trying to find a cure for my fear.
Well, I say my version of the therapy is that I kill off people who annoy me, including in romances. I can have pretty high body count in the romances. And I have an unending source.
Oh, you know, people you want to kill.
I've worked through a lot of former coworkers, but now, you know.
We have that luxury as writers, as we get that opportunity. We can fantasize. We can have anything we fantasize about happen in those stories.
And we know who it's happening to, but they never recognize themselves. That's hilarious. So, okay, we've gotten way off, and I still have all those follow-up questions, but let's let readers get to know you a little bit in some other ways. And let's, since we talked about Kobo, but this won't count. So we need a surprising job that you've held.
Surprising job. I don't know. Is security guard surprising enough? The fact that
Oh, that's pretty good. You would be an imposing security guard. I could see that.
When I had hair and stuff, I was still imposing, and I got to work front of stage at so many events in Ottawa, Ontario, and it was really amazing experience. And I'm not. I mean, I'm a large man, 6'3". I look scary and intimidating. I am a pussycat. So, me trying to arm wrestle, drunk people to the ground and stop fights and stuff. I'm not a fighter at all. I just, I count on the intimidation of my size. But, I got into so many scraps and things like that, the adrenaline was just pumping like crazy whenever I had to. And a lot of times it was more helping people, and I'd always been a huge fan of Peter Parker and Spider-Man, and with great power comes great responsibility. So I'd always wanted to do good in all those things. So I think security guard was one of the most fun jobs that I never would have seen myself doing, but ended up doing throughout university.
Did you see shows that you thought, oh boy, this is going to be boring, I don't want to, know, but you liked it? But you liked it?
Willie Nelson. I was two things. I mean, I grew up on country music, so by the time I was in my 20s, I was like, okay, enough of this. I want to break free and listen to stuff my parents don't listen to and all that stuff. And so I was working the Willie Nelson concert in the mid-90s in Ottawa. And two things. I loved the show. The audience was amazing. There was nobody tried to tackle the stage or anything, so I could just enjoy the show. And then he stayed at the very end because I couldn't leave until he left the stage. He sat on the edge of the stage and signed albums and talked to every single fan who wanted to talk to him. And I created such a huge respect. So whenever I hear his music today, I think about that kind, generous, genuine person who was there for his fans. Now I was complaining because I was making time and a half overtime because I had to get back to school the next day, and it was like 2 a.m. It was like, come on, Willie, let's go. I want to go home. But when I think about it now, I just think about the respect that I have for that artist who, he gave them what they came for, but he stayed and gave them even more. And he probably created memories for these fans that will last their entire lifetime.
And I can see a thread from that to you're talking about when readers come up to you like at Comic-Con.
Yeah, think about that.
Yeah, I can definitely see that connection. Do you have any wonderful stories about interacting with readers yourself?
I think one of the most touching moments, I'd never got to interact with this reader myself, but it was sort of a science fiction-y story that was meant to be used in a grade 4 classroom based on the Ontario science curriculum, and it was edited by Julie Cherneda, who's a science fiction writer with a background in education. And Julie forwarded me something that a teacher, so this was being used in a grade 4 classroom, and the stories were based on science. And so you had to take a scientific principle that would have been taught in grade 4 science and then write a story about it. And then the science teacher could use it to introduce the concept. So my concept was properties of light. And so I have a kid going to his uncle's who's an inventor, and he has a special glass made out of a special ice that, if you smash it, it can reform the window pane easily. So the kid's just having a ball, breaking the window and watching it come back again. And he puts the wrong chemical in, so the glass becomes like a slow glass, and they can see back in time the light slows down enough but doesn't refract. So he's like 2 minutes into the past, and they use it to solve a crime. So it's just like a fun YA young reader story. And I got from one of the teachers who was using it in the class, I got a story that this young boy had written after reading my story. So the two most wonderful things about this were, A, he was a reluctant reader. He had never finished a story in his life. He did not like reading. B, when he finished it, he loved it so much he wanted to write his own stories. And I still have that story.
That's
so I
amazing.
didn't get to see this fan in person, but I'm just I adore the fact that, wow, I helped this boy discover, because you and I both know the magic, and your listeners know the magic and power and beauty of reading. And I helped the boy discover that. Like, if I do nothing else as an author, I have succeeded huge.
That's terrific. That's a wonderful story. From that plane, we'll bring it back down. We'll say, do you have a favorite taste?
A favorite taste besides beer?
Okay, I think we got that one in one. Favorite color?
Green.
And if you do,
Green,
why?
Yeah.
Green. Why?
It's always been a thing that the color has always just felt warm and homey to me.
Multiple shades of it, or we're talking because you can go lime?
Even if they get gross, I prefer the darker shades of green, but I'll take the 50 shades of green. Yes, I will.
Good for you. As somebody with strong Irish background, I appreciate green too.
I know Leslie's Scottish, but I've always wished I could have been Irish.
Yeah, you can be. Well, we will spread the mantle.
Thank you. And I was. Every St. Patrick's Day, I become Irish for 24 hours.
Is this back to beer?
A little bit, but never green beer. Never green beer. That's sacrilegious.
But rivers can be green. Yeah. See, that's my theory. I often ask people about strong fears, but it sounds like, and if they use them in books, it sounds like you use all of yours.
Constantly. My biggest fear, though, used to be my dad dying, and then I wrote a novel about it. And when that happened, a year later, my son was born, and then my biggest fear became something bad happening to my son. So, of course, it was always that father-son connection was always related to the fear, and I've drawn upon that so many times in my fiction because it's easy. Because it's natural. It's just what I feel.
Well, I'm curious why you were worried about your dad dying.
I don't know. I'd always...
Had he been in ill health?
Or? No. He was always in great health. I mean, he died suddenly, unexpectedly on an operating room table. It was a complete shock. But no, it was just, I don't know why. It was always something that bothered me. Like my Baba, my grandmother, from the time I was little, and she was probably only in her 40s or 50s, but she always seemed to be like 112, and she always seemed to be on her deathbed. Like she was always sickly and stuff like that. And she lived a good long life, a wonderful woman. But, I was never, it was just sad when I lost her because she was a wonderful woman and I loved and adored her. But there was always just something about the dad. I mean, interestingly, because it's about the fiction that we write is, when my dad died, he died on an operating room table, and for the next year, I kept seeing him everywhere I went. I'd be driving on the highway, and the guy in the car beside me, I could swear was my dad. I swore I saw him at a train station across the tracks one day, and I thought, oh my God, what if he's still alive? So I wrote the novel Evasion, which is based on a guy who thinks his dad's alive, starts investigating what might happen because he saw him and he knows it's him. Because my dad had a distinctive walk because he had broken his leg in a really bad motorcycle accident when he was 20. So he couldn't walk properly. He had like a very particular walk. So it's one of those distinguishing characters. And so this guy sees this, he's doing the investigation. And then of course he's onto something because suddenly people are trying to kill him. And so that was Evasion, which was one of those NaNoWriMo novels. I was like, I got to get this out of my system because the concept was just kicking in the back of my head. And I aborted 3 different stories with the same opening. And then I finally just wrote the novel 1 month.
Did it turn out the way you expected it to?
I had no idea because I'm a complete pantser. I had no idea. I knew, okay, his dad's alive. I haven't figured out why he's alive or what he's up to.
So he was alive.
Yeah, and so in this story, he ends up bumping into his father, and then and obviously he learns what happened and why his father had to fake his death. And so it became this an interesting thriller. Now, here's an interesting aside that takes it back to the Kobo building. I was writing it for NaNoWriMo. I hadn't done any research. I had 30 days to write the book, so National Novel Writing Month. And so I sat
in November.
It's in an office. The opening scene, there's a prologue where he sees his father at the train station, and then it's 18 months later. He's still researching because he thinks that was him. He's got to be alive. I'm going to look into it, check out the doctors, what was going on at the hospital, what happened. And so the novel actually opens with chapter 1 where his boss calls him into his office, pulls a gun, tries to kill him, and then from that point on, every single person he meets is trying to kill him. And then he's flashing back to his childhood and this weird, relationship he had with his father. And so I set the novel at the Kobo building because I didn't have time to research a location. So it was just, I would walk upstairs and go, okay, so if he was going to run from this room to that room, it would be 30 steps. And I called it Digilife, a digital insurance company that he was working at. But I set it in that building at Kobo because I was just lazy. And I set it at the GO train station where he saw his dad, because that's not where I thought I saw my father. So it was like all these lazy things where I just drew elements from my day-to-day experience into the story.
Mark, that's not lazy. That is using what you know.
It's research every day is.
It's efficient.
That's true. Yeah, good point. It is efficient. That's for sure.
I often say that writing is the greatest recycling there is.
Oh my God, I love that quote. I'm using it.
Everything that comes into our head comes back out. So one of the things I was thinking about before when we were talking is that, to me, reading, books are interactive. Right. That we put something down, and when you were talking about people in the future maybe reading your story that you'd written in 2004, and what you put down then can be picked up in 2024 by somebody who will never know you, who has a totally different life. And so what they bring into the reading takes something totally different and recreates your story in a way for them.
It's their story. It's not mine anymore. And I love that. And that's why reading is magic, because 100 different people reading the exact same text will come away with 100 different experiences because they adapt their own life experience. I mean, it's magic. It's really, we are magicians. It's awesome. We're privileged that we get to play in this world. These worlds, I should say.
But I love it as a reader. I don't like it as much as a writer. I want them to take what I put down.
Yeah, but you have to let go of it, don't you?
Megalomania.
But you have to let go of it. I mean, I've written plays for kids that I've given to teachers, and it's so amazing because I originally wrote versions of the play when I was teaching drama, when I was doing that as a summer job in university, and I was the director, so I knew my vision as the writer, and then I knew my vision as the director. But then I went to opening night when they performed it at the school, and I was blown away by elements they added to my play of character development and humor that I hadn't written, but they had discovered. And again, I got to witness magic from this creativity of these students and the teacher who was directing it. That was just mind-boggling awesome.
I wrote a book early on in my career, and a friend read it and said, well, this is the middle book of a trilogy. And I said, you can't fool me. The trilogy has to have 3 books, and there's only one. Right. And she said, no, go back and look. You've got all the seeds planted. And darn if she wasn't right. And there's so many things that I think are subconscious or unconscious drops in there. And I wonder if in the play, if people were picking up things that you had unconsciously laid the groundwork for. And if you've ever had a story where you went back and read it later and thought, I didn't see that in my own work. And maybe, and one of the questions from our readers is when you finish a story, do you miss the characters, and do you find yourself thinking about them? And then I like to find out if that's ever led you to write another story. So take all those 7 or 8 questions I just jammed in and come up with an answer.
There are some characters who you just love so much. I'm going to give you a couple examples that are sort of along these lines. So when I was in grade 10, we had a free writing exercise, and the teacher, Mr. Furman, loved him, English teacher. And I got to tell him this. So, any of the teachers that you've had that you appreciate, if they're still around and you get a chance to let them know how much they impacted your life. That's That's why they do it. That's such an amazing experience. So Mr. Furman had free writing, which meant he didn't care what you did for 30 minutes every Friday. In class, you're going to write something. You could doodle, you could play hangman with yourself, you could do tic-tac-toe, like anything you wanted to do. And so because I loved stories, I wrote a story. It was a 1,000-word story called I, Death, about a suicidal teenager who believes he has a death curse. And I remember Mr. Furman's note on the end of it, because he would read them all. You just had to turn it in, and you got graded yes or no. Did you do it or not? And you got full marks if you did it, and no marks if you didn't do. And it didn't matter what it was. Could have been, a doodle or whatever. And on the manuscript, he wrote, "And staring back at him is the Twilight Zone," because the guys looked into a mirror, and that's how the story ended. I came back to the story. So Peter O'Malley, I hadn't even named him in this story, but in my mind, that was his name. And when I was in university and I was supposed to be studying, I wanted to see what might happen next to Peter. And I wrote this story about what might happen 4 or 5 years later. And I tried to send that story away and get it published. And this is back in the early days of snail mail and mailing manuscripts to magazines and stuff like that.
Oh, yes.
And then it wasn't until 2006, I believe, I wanted to combine the first story and the second story, and I kept playing with it, and I didn't know what to do with it. So I decided, because the initial story was a journal, it was a single journal entry from this character, I thought, what if I did it as a blog? Because I'd been blogging already for a few years. What if I release it as a blog from his character's point of view and tell his story? And I told the story over 9 months on a blog using a Blogspot blog, and the suicidal teenager. And so it ended up becoming my book, I, Death, which was cool because a publisher actually picked it up and wanted to publish it. So it's now available. But one of the other things that happened was, while I was writing the story, so Peter O'Malley has a death curse. Everyone he gets close to dies some horrible death. So it's just like this tragic scene. And in it, I have him learning about Hamlet, because I loved Hamlet when I was a kid, and I get to play with all the things I loved about my favorite teachers and inputted them. And then I have, so his teacher's in a horrific car accident. She's in a coma. He loved his teacher. And so obviously, because he liked her, something bad happened to her. This supply teacher comes in, and the whole idea was he's supposed to be a kind of coolish, neat character. I was going to have him walk on. Peter ends up accidentally killing him. And then you found out that he was a bad guy, and Peter goes, "Oh my God, I can use my powers for good." So that was the whole idea. So Mr. Robinson, who the kids call Robbie, comes in, and I started to base his character a little bit on some of my favorite teachers, like Gary Furman and Jim Turcotte, who was an amazing math teacher. So my favorite elements of both those teachers combined with John Keating from the Dead Poets Society. Robin Williams' character in that movie. So I combined all my favorite teachers, mixed a little of John Keating in there, and then I, as I was writing Robbie, words came out of his mouth, and I was loving it, and my readers were loving it because they were commenting live on this blog as I was rolling the story out. And then I got to a point and I went, "Oh my God," and I had to break the fourth wall, and I put a note and I said, "Okay, listen, Robbie's got to die." I set it up so he should die, but I fell in love with him so much. He was supposed to be a bad guy. I don't know if I can do that anymore. So I had the readers decide for me, should he die a good guy or a bad guy? And that was the case where Robbie, Mr. Robinson, he was just such an amazing character. I loved so much. And unfortunately, he's dead. But the readers...
So they voted to have him die?
Well, there was no vote. He had to die. He had to die, but I needed to know if he should die.
Whether good guy or bad guy.
And they told me what they wanted, and so I did that. So that was one of the most amazing experiences for me.
I would have rewritten it so he lived.
Maybe he faked his death and he's still alive somewhere. No.
Yeah, I like that. Okay. Somebody was after him, and he had to
Peter
escape.
Saw him die.
Wherever he escapes, he finds a good relationship,
too. He should have a great relationship where he can teach really cool kids. So
yeah. I don't
sorry.
like
See, that's why you don't want to read my horror novels. because some of the good guys die. That's no fun.
So I ask a lot of authors if there were stories that in their pre-author days that they mentally rewrote the ending to because they didn't like it. And a lot of the romance writers will say, like Gone with the Wind. And so it had a happy ending. So I'm a little afraid to ask you this question, Mark, because I'm afraid you're going to have what's a story with a really good ending? It's a Wonderful Life, and he jumps off the bridge and drowns.
It was all just a dream as he was on his way down to hit the water, right? He dreamt all the angels and everything. I've got one. So Mark Twain wrote this amazing story called A Curious Dream. And Mark Twain did a lot of political commentary and humor and stuff like this. And it's a story about a guy at Halloween sitting on his front step, and he hears this weird noise, and he sees all these skeletons dragging their coffin down the street. And one of them stops and talks to him because, it's natural to just have a conversation with a skeleton dragging a coffin down the street. But again, it's dark humor, Mark Twain stuff. And he's basically saying, being dead used to be such an honor, but you losers have let the cemetery go to hell, and we're leaving. We're moving to a different cemetery. And it was him. He was reflecting on how we need to respect the dead. Why are we letting these cemeteries fall? It was just a cute little story. So I wrote a story called Memento Mori, inspired by this story, where it's a darker ending, where the narrator who's talking to this dead person who comes up, it has a much darker twist where I went, he didn't go far enough with this. It should have been, let's show them what could happen if they don't respect the dead. So I did that. And because the Mark Twain piece is public domain, I've actually published, the short story was published already, but then I took it as an ebook. I put my story called, an ode to Mark Twain's A Curious Dream. I have my story, and then I also put the initial Mark Twain story and why he inspired me to write that. So that was a really fun thing to do. Thank goodness it was public domain, so I could get away with that, because I probably couldn't afford to purchase the rights to it.
How have people responded to that?
It hasn't gotten many reviews, but people who read it tend to enjoy it because it's written in the same style, and it's like a pastiche or an ode to a Mark Twain tale. So anyone who's familiar with A Curious Dream by Mark Twain, if they read it, because the subtitle is A Curious Nightmare, And in it, the opening line is, in honor of, or an ode. The story is an ode to Mark Twain. And I love that because when I was reading the Romantics, I studied English in university. I was amazed and impressed by how often poets and writers of the time would refer to their colleagues in their writing, being inspired by it. And I thought, no, I know I'm not a colleague of Mark Twain's, but it's interesting that I can read another writer and he inspires something in me, and I want to acknowledge what inspired me because I still love his story. But again, as you suspected, I took it to a darker place.
Well, it's a good thing we have a balance, right?
And, that's right.
All sorts of possibilities for readers of all sorts of tastes and moods. Because I also think a lot, at least for myself as a reader, I want to read different things at different times.
Right.
It's like you get a taste for something, and it's okay. Today I want. But
also that there's the convention. So, for example, I honestly believe that if a writer or reader is going to invest in a full-length novel, the better damn well have a happy ending, right? Because they invested all this time in the characters. Now, most of my short stories, half of them happy ending, half of them either you don't know what happens because that's the twist, or it's a sad ending. It's like a tragedy, but you can get away with that in a short story because this story is 1,500 words. So something scary happens. It teaches the guy a lesson. Look at this. If that were a novel, I would have to have him learn the lesson, overcome the try-fail cycles, and then it would have to be a happy ending for the most part. I think it's more difficult to get away with that in a long piece because the reader has really invested, and you're really going to do some damage. You can do a bad or sad ending or non-Hollywood ending, but you better know what you're doing, and you can't do it in a romance novel. That's for sure, because they're gonna tear you a new one, aren't they?
Well, and you say a non-Hollywood ending, but in fact, I think of the Hollywood endings, especially in romances, as and then one of them dies, or if it's not, and then they both die.
Yeah, and then you Fault in Our Stars, and you're crying your eyes out. Stuff like
Yeah.
that.
And I'm thinking, no, no, I don't want this. Go
Yeah.
away.
Give them a happy ending, for God's sakes. Life is tough
Yeah.
enough. There's too many challenges. Let the people get together and love each other.
Yes.
I know.
I might also, and people say, oh, that's so unrealistic. And I think, my folks, bless their hearts, were married for 70 and a half years.
Oh my
and
God.
loved each other dearly. And
That's beautiful.
it does too happen.
It does happen. No, and
Yeah.
we need to have that hope too. I think it's just so important to have
Yeah.
hope. So I mean, even in this horror novel where I kill off one of my favorite teacher, I mean, it has a happy ending. The good guys beat the bad guys,
Well, that is okay. And so that's, that is a sacrifice and okay.
Yeah.
Oh, now, from your folks, your mom or your dad,
Yeah.
did they have sayings that they said to you as a kid that now you hear coming out of your voice? Yeah, out of your mouth?
Oh, yeah, all the time. So, you little Christer is what my dad used to say when I hope I'm allowed to say some off-color words here. And I've said that a couple times to my son and to the cats when they're being bad. And yeah, and I've actually used the phrase, I'm not paying to heat the outdoors, because when you become a parent, physics doesn't make sense anymore.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
Yeah, I've used them, but I've also, I've applied some of the sayings in terms of some of the wisdom that my parents passed on to me that I
Mm.
couldn't appreciate until I was in their shoes and went, "Oh, that's what he meant." 30 years later, "Oh, that's what Dad meant when he said that."
My dad was very Irish, and there was a family dispute at one point centering on between my father and my brother arguing with each other. And my dad said in a fairly loud voice, "There is no logic in volume." And everybody stopped and went, "Write that down." Write that down. So
Oh, I love that.
isn't that wonderful?
Yeah, and you've used that now?
Oh yes, and used it on him.
Oh, that's funny.
That was the meanest turn to use the saying on himself. But yeah, we have quite a few family sayings. And
cool.
I want to, do you have any motivational or upbeat sayings that you like? Or do you have any dark and downbeat
No, I
sayings
have
that
a
you like?
ton of motivational things that I love. So one of my favorite writing quotes that hangs near the wall where I write is from Hugh Prather, and it was from his book Notes to Myself. And it is, "If the desire to write is not accompanied by actual writing, then the desire is not to write." And to me, that's a reminder that it's one thing to call yourself a writer, it's another thing to be a writer. And if I am not writing every day, if I am not committing myself to putting those words down on paper, whether it's digital or real paper, I'm not writing. I'm not following my desire. The desire must be not to write then if you're not writing. And it's a simple phrase, but for between 20 and 30 years, I've kept that quote within sight from where I sit down to write most days.
The interesting thing about that, and I think if there's anybody in the audience who is interested in writing, I would add to that it's a moment to moment question. Because I spent a lot of time early on saying I wanted to write books, and I didn't know how to try to start or to start to try. And even when I did start to try, it wasn't, I was grasping for ways that worked for me. And it took quite a few tries to find something that let me complete a story.
Okay.
And so there were a lot of years where I would say to a few very close friends and family members that I wanted to write novels, but I wasn't actually writing. So, like I'm saying, it's not a death sentence. It's not a done deal if you're not writing at the moment. But that, yes, you have to actually write to get to where you have written.
Yeah,
Does that make
exactly.
sense?
Yeah, of course. And that's the reminder to me when I think about, I was thinking the other day, I haven't written a short story in a long time. And short stories are so satisfactory because, you can almost do them in a single sitting, right? Depending on the story. Some of them are longer and more complex, but for the most part, it's a single sitting. And I hadn't done that in a long, long time, and I forgot the satisfaction. And it's the same satisfaction you get with a novel, although the satisfaction with a novel is a much bigger buildup and much bigger level of relief when you get the first draft done. But it's still, you get those little mini bursts of excitement when you actually complete a story in and of itself. And so I've just told myself just this week, I'm going to set some goals to just write some new short stories because I miss that, and not like it's a snack, but it's also different because you have to be more disciplined. In a novel, I can go on and get into the character motivation and all the depth and background. In a short story, I have to be way more concise. I have to be way more precise, and I have to be careful not to throw the reader out of the story because, again, haven't invested as much, so it's easier to get kicked out of something they haven't invested as much in. So for me, that writing saying is a really strong reminder of what it is that have always been most passionate about, which is telling stories.
I'm not a short story writer. I'm not let's say the first I think at least 4 times I tried to write a novella that became novels. So it took me 5 shots. So it's very foreign to me, and that makes it very interesting. So
Yeah.
when you have an idea, do you immediately know this is a story versus this is a novel? And you talked about the novel that you get into characterization and all that, which made me wonder if do you think that the story, a short story, is more focused on the on what happens as opposed to who it happens to?
Yeah, no, I think the main difference is in a story, let's say you have a sentence to denote a character, right? Or let's say it's a sentence where you can express characterization about someone, whether it's dialogue or action or whatever they're doing, even sometimes what they're thinking. In a novel, you may get a couple pages, maybe not all at the same time. You have a couple pages to develop that character. In a short story, you got a sentence or two, or maybe a few sentences, but the whole story, if it's let's say it's 1,000 or because it's a really, really short story or a 5,000 word story, you're going to not be able to get into. So, sometimes getting as far into the character's head and perspective as you can, it's more of a luxury in a novel, I find, where I go, oh, so I've taken short stories. So Michael Andrews, My Canadian Werewolf in New York, it was a 10,000 word short story. And I had somebody say, this has got to be a novel. I want to know what happens next. So I had so much fun because I loved Michael Andrews. I love the character in this 10,000 word story, which I couldn't make shorter because
Yeah.
there was so much I wanted to do that I went, oh my God, I've only done the first hour of his day. I get to do the whole rest of his day now. And I get to be in his head even more. And that novel was it was so much fun to see the world, to see New York through Michael's eyes, which, and again, in many ways, Michael was me in awe and loving being in the big city because I'm from a small Northern Ontario town. So there's that contrast of him seeing New York through those innocent, naive eyes. And so, yeah, that was an amazing experience. But I was at a workshop at Dean Wesley Smith and Christine Catherine Rushwright. And one of the writers in the workshop, it was hilarious because the story assignments were usually about 6,000 words on average, and he would be turning in 12,000 and 15,000 word stories.
My kind of
And
guy.
I know it's hilarious, but then I said, Lee, come on, the guidelines say no more than 6,000 words, and he turned in a 14,000 word story that was amazing, and he said I didn't have enough time to write a shorter story. Didn't have enough time to take some of those things and say, okay, this 2 pages of character development, I got to dumb that down to a paragraph, but I have to still contain all the element. It's kind of like you have a recipe for this massive meal and you're trying to contain all the elements of the meal and make it into a single serving dish. You can't just reduce the contents. You have to be very creative with the way you reduce them. And I think the difference between novel and story. I've gotten on a huge sidetrack, which I'm sorry I keep doing that to you, but
No,
I think
that's okay.
it's an important element. So, I mean, even one of the other things I was talking to my partner Liz this morning about, and I said, because I was working on the sequel to A Canadian Werewolf in New York called Fear and Longing in Los Angeles, where Michael is in LA and he's, it's a whole new adventure, different city to explore. And I was like, I miss shorter Michael stories. So I was like, I'm going to write some shorter, probably 10,000 word stories of Michael, because I've left almost 2 years between when the novel, the first book in the series ends and the second one picks up. Because they are standalone. But, I've got the relationship with his girlfriend. That was a huge time factor. Because it was funny, when I talked about it, I went, well, it's a thriller. She goes, no, but what compelled me through the story was whether or not Michael and Gail would get back together. Like that and again, I was like, yeah, because that was important to me, because he loved Gail, he loved her with all his heart, and he was horrified that they were only friends, and he wanted to be more. And so there's this conflict throughout it. And it was funny. So anyways, I went, maybe I should write the meet cute. Maybe I should write in more detail when they met and how they met and how he fell in love with her. That would be so much fun for me to do. So anyways, that's just an example of, the difference between so a novel has to have a much larger story arc and subplots and multiple characters, where a story cannot usually doesn't include as many characters or as many moving parts, and is usually sometimes it can be a scene or a chapter, something like that.
Yeah, I like moving parts. I seem to keep adding moving parts.
That's funny. But that's why you write that. But you also explore in multiple volumes that touch upon the same characters, right?
Yes, although they'll usually be secondary in the romances. They'll usually be secondary characters in additional books. I'm writing a first-person mystery series where the protagonist is the same protagonist through now 6-7 books.
Instead of where you've gone to the different, but again, you've taken a minor character from book A, and they become the focus character in book B.
Not in the mysteries.
Not in the mysteries, but in some of your other novels.
Right. Yes, I do. And yeah, I can't, because that's another way to keep writing that story. and I like the community. I like the sense of community and the connection of the various characters, whether it's family or a town or a workplace, or just an interweaving of friends and people. And so I get to keep going back to that. And I am doing that in the mysteries too. So it's the same sleuth with this group of people who help her.
Yeah, supporting characters. You get to maybe focus on. It's always the main character, but maybe you learn more about this supporting character in book 3 that you only teased upon in book 1.
Yeah, and the theory of writing short stories, and as you're doing, intermediate between the novels, is really appealing. I don't know. I think I'll end up.
You have enough on your plate, don't you?
Well, could always do something more. So, okay. A reader asks, I want to get to these reader questions, because we keep going on and off, which is both really fun. But she says, where do your stories come from? I know one author who dreams her stories. Another has a character suddenly taking up residence in her head. So how are your beautiful stories born?
There's a warehouse in Tacoma that's an old Harlan Ellison quote, I think.
Yeah.
So ideas.
That means you have to import them, though. If it's in Tacoma.
Have to import them, and the exchange between U.S. and Canada is just crazy, and then I got to pay brokerage fees. No, honest to God, my problem is, where don't I find ideas? Because everywhere I go, everything I experience gets put into this pot, and it stirs around. And sometimes it's there for years before I draw upon it, and sometimes I have to draw upon it right away. So, for example, the story about the Sandman killing the Tooth Fairy.
Mm-hmm.
That was one of the ones. We were sitting down at dinner. My son had just lost a tooth, and we were talking about the tooth fairy, and he said something, and in my head, I got the idea. When I was 8 years old, I saw the Sandman kill the tooth fairy. I went, hang on a second. I went upstairs. I wrote 4 lines of, like four paragraphs, and went, okay. I came back down, had dinner, and then after dinner, I went back and finished the story.
Oh, wow.
Because the ideas come from everywhere, and every single experience. I mean, like you said, it was research. You in the building you're in became an element of the story, and places you've been and people you've seen. And I love people watching. So, travel a lot for Kobo, and I still travel a lot now in my post-Kobo life because I'm still doing consulting and I'm still going to writers' conferences. I adore airports because they're just in restaurants and cafes. It's a plethora of people watching. And I have probably 100 ideas a day, and maybe one of those ideas ends up staying in the pot, or 2 or 3 of them stay in the pot, and then they get drawn upon at a later date. So I think I draw my ideas from things that happen to me, things that happen to other people that I've witnessed or they've shared. Sometimes someone tells you a really cool story, and you go, "Ooh, that inspires me to whatever." I can guarantee both you and I, because I'm positive about this, both you and I, during the course of the last 50 odd minutes in our conversation, we have both already had 2 or 3 ideas for stories that may or may not end up in a novel or in a scene one day. Am I correct? Am I right?
And I think a lot of times there are what are the things in chemistry that have to mesh with something else to really be active. My really scientific, but so they're kind of free floating for a long time, and then another idea comes, and then they get together, and there it goes. Okay, now it's
like peanut butter and chocolate, right?
Oh, see, I don't like
peanut butter and chocolate are pretty cool. Oh, that was a bad example. Okay, so
chocolate
like beer
and chocolate.
Okay, like chocolate with a layer of a different kind of chocolate, like a dark chocolate around it, or a soft chocolate inside of a heart. Yeah, there you go. But again, they're both great on their own, but then you bring them together and come up with this whole new idea, which is kind of fun, right? That's the magic of these floating ideas that we get to. I'm privileged that every single day I get to move around in a world that continually bombards me with ideas.
Now, you mentioned going to writers' conferences, and you kind of go in a dual role, I would think, at all times. But because you go partly in the role, or have gone partly in the role of, I'm going to say a professional, which makes it sound like the writers are not professional, and that's not true. But you're in a position where you can sort of observe writers to an extent too. Do you think that writers are different from, I want to say, normal people?
Normal.
The majority of the population. How's that?
Not everyone gets to kill people they don't like in their stories and pretend that it's a fictional character. No, I think
it's good therapy.
So. It's kind of funny. Non-writers don't give me ideas, but non-writers have neat ideas and concepts all the time. They just channel their energy in different ways. They go, "Oh, wouldn't this be neat?" And then they move on. I think writers say, "Oh, wouldn't this be neat? Oh, wouldn't it be neat if also this character and that character in this situation? Oh, wouldn't that be? Oh," and then they're gone. You're lost. My ex-wife we used to be out somewhere. And she would see this stunned look on my face, like I'm not there at all. I'm looking in another direction. She goes, "You're writing right now, aren't you?" And I went, "Okay, guilty."
Yeah.
And it happens sometimes when I'm watching a movie or TV show where I pause and I go off, and suddenly I'm in my own head, and now I'm writing my own story because maybe I'm either enjoying it, but I just saw something that triggered something, or I'm in a cafe, I overheard dialogue from the table beside me, and now I'm starting to fill in the blanks. Well, why did that person say that?
I did.
And so suddenly I'm creating stuff about the characters, and Liz and I sometimes do that, which is kind of fun. We kind of look at people and go, "Okay, are they on a first date? What do you think?"
Yeah.
And then we come up with stories for so she's not she's not a creative writer. She doesn't write fiction. She's in education, but she's fascinated by people. So when we're together, the two of us are playing in that writer space. She's playing very creatively, and she's one of the most creative people I know. But again, she doesn't turn that into stories. I turn that into stories. So even though we can have the same approach and love people watching and all those, I end up taking it. What is it? Are we nothing more than plagiarizing all the amazing free-flowing ideas and things we see every day and just recompile? Like, we're taking the way our minds take everything we experience every day, and they give us these really weird dreams. That's kind of what writers do in a sense, is we take all this input that is coming, and then we go, okay, here you go. This is what I got out of that. I'm wondering if that.
But as I said before, we recycle it, and so we recombine it in different ways and make different connections, and present it to people, and it looks totally different.
Which is brilliant. I love that quote. I wrote that down, by the way.
Well, I'm honored. Thank you very much.
I will attribute you.
I often think the one book that I know very clearly where the idea came from was my second book, and it has a modern day Irish immigrant hero. And it came from a conversation I was having with an older gentleman in a pub in Ireland before I wrote the book. And he said to me, Ireland's greatest export has always been its youth. And I thought, What a great quote. And then I started thinking, well, I understood why earlier, like when my ancestors came over, but why now? And that got me, why? and
I know, you ask questions.
Yeah. So
that's fantastic.
So is there anything that I haven't asked you that you wanted to answer?
No, you know what? You have asked some truly amazing questions. So you and the readers who've submitted questions, just amazing questions. So thank you for this delightful conversation. I had a really good time.
Well, we're not quite done yet, because first of all, tell people how they can get in touch with you, how they can learn out more about you and your books.
Okay, so markleslie.ca. If you go to any of the major bookstores like Amazon or Kobo, which I should mention since I work there, you can just search Mark Leslie and you'll find most of my stuff. At Mark Leslie on Twitter is also another quick way to find me.
Okay, we will also have those in the show notes, so folks don't have to try to write those down while they're listening in the car or jogging or doing whatever they're doing. Right. They will be on the website. And now this is my absolute favorite part. It's I consider it the epilogue. It's either or questions, rapid fire.
All right.
So, okay. And we'll see whether you're more cooperative than a lot of the other authors who try to weasel out of either or.
No, I'll try to be black and white here, even though it is a gray world.
And we will go with that for the start. Day or night?
Day.
Really interesting.
Night is too scary. Night is where all my scary things happen. So day, it's got to be day, so that the ghosts and monsters are gone.
Okay. Opera or show tunes?
Show tunes. Although I love opera, but show tunes. Got to be show tunes, because you know what? We should, in our lives, we should sing and dance more often. Everyone should get up and just sing what we're feeling. I love it to death. I love those scenes.
Fabulous. Okay. Paper plates or best china?
Best china, only because you can reuse them, and I'm a fan of recycling.
Okay. House decorating or gardening?
House decorating, especially Halloween.
Oh, I see what you do. Okay, I was thinking the more basic. So, Halloween is your favorite holiday?
It should be a month long. It's just shame that it's only one day for everyone else.
Well, let's say then, though, as a season, though, spring or fall?
Fall. Absolutely adore the fall. Even though spring is that magical time, the fall really has always spoken to me in just amazing ways.
Because it's spooky, or?
It's spooky. It has Halloween in it. The leaves here where I live change color, and I love my seasons distinct. And there's nothing. It's like it's halfway between winter and summer, and it's got all the elements of. If I could only be in one season perpetually ever, it would have to be fall. It just seems it's magical. It's change, and even though there's death in fall, right? The leaves are dying,
Yeah.
the trees are
Yep.
dying or whatever. They're going to sleep. There's going to be a rebirth. It's going to come back. So even though it can seem sad and the days are getting longer and it's darker, I think there's something magical and beautiful about the fall that speaks to me.
Well, in keeping with the seasons question, I'm going to ask you another takeoff. Summer Olympics or Winter Olympics?
I prefer the Summer Olympics.
Okay.
Yeah, I do prefer, even though I live in a winter wonderland up here in the north, I do prefer Summer Olympics.
Notice that my question presupposes that somebody has to love the Olympics.
Oh, I see. I don't do sport, and the only sport I do is Olympics. So I actually do watch Summer and Winter Olympics. Yeah, I do love the Olympics too.
Pickup or sports car?
I think pickup, only because it's more practical, and I carry a lot of, let's say I carry a lot of ideas and baggage with me, so the pickup makes it easier for that.
Hiking boots or cowboy boots?
Hiking boots for sure. Got to get into nature, got to explore, and yeah, that's the best way to do it.
Ice cream or cake?
Ice cream for sure.
I'm going to be really mean here, because cat or dog?
Dog.
Oh.
Dogs are loyal and they love you, and cats don't give a crap about you. They're just so obstinate. Even though they're fun and I love them both, I would take a dog over a cat any day.
Hot air balloon or train trip?
I think there's something magical about both, but the train trip, it just speaks to history as well as to the community you can actually connect with on this limited voyage.
Have you ever done the Trans-Canadian?
Not yet,
I
but
want to do
that's
that.
my bucket.
Yeah,
it's on my bucket
me too.
list.
Coffee or tea?
Coffee. 99.9999% of the time.
But we know-
100% of the time.
We know the real answer is beer.
Yeah, well, no, but in the morning it's coffee.
Okay. From noon on.
That's right.
Go with the best first or save the best for last?
Save the best for last.
That's excellent.
Even though it's kind of like, I know too many people who died before they retired, but I still think save the best for last, because what a way to go.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Mark. Really appreciated the time, and this was a lot of fun. And
thank you.
Our listeners, I hope you'll come back next week and hear another author talking about what they write and how they write it and the stories behind their stories. Have a good week of reading in the meantime. That's the show for this week. Hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for joining Authors Love Readers podcast. Remember, you can always find out more about our guest authors in the show notes, and you can find out more about me at www.patriciamclinn.com. You can also send in questions to be asked of future authors at podcast@authorslovereaders.com. Until next week, wishing you lots of happy reading. Bye.